Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, Slackers? Welcome back to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and I am slowly but surely on the road to recovery. I'm certainly pleased that I have another episode to bring you this week with Justin Piccirillo, because I'm not sure that I could get through a whole podcast. Still feeling a little bit under the weather, but certainly a huge improvement from last week. So thanks for coming back for another episode. This week has been really interesting because when I started this podcast, it was meant to be just me creating content that I would be interested in hearing about topics that I'm interested in. And I knew that family and friends would listen to it, either because they felt obliged to, or maybe they fit the demographic, or maybe there were people that I was calling up and tapping to be guests on the show. But then a funny thing happened. People outside of my little circle up here in the Northeast began taking notice of the show and have begun to listen. It kind of caught me off guard. But I have to tell you all, I am so thankful to know that these just crazy ramblings, interesting conversations with friends, people that you don't know, that I know very well, is interesting enough for you to come back week after week. And for all you new listeners, some of you, from what I can tell from the statistics here, have binged all the episodes and really jumped in from start to finish. You've floored me. You've blown me away that you find this little podcast interesting. So just looking at the kind of makeup of listenership, I want to say welcome to the folks in Colorado and Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Idaho, Florida, Indiana, Pennsylvania, DC, New York, Washington, Oklahoma, Minnesota. Thank you all for joining, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for interacting with me on various social media platforms. It is really cool, and I really appreciate it because, like I said, I'm just some dude rambling, and you come back and listen to my idiot voice. It's amazing. So thank you. However, with that, although the feedback that I have received has been overwhelmingly positive, that's not to say that there hasn't been negative. Now, even if there's negative feedback, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, because it's something that I can learn from. Maybe it gives me something to work towards, look at different approaches. I just look at these as opportunities to learn and maybe put some things into practice. Now, one of the things that was brought to my attention is the placement of things like advertisements. Now, to me, advertisements are just, for lack of a better term, a necessary evil. Even though I do this for the love of the game, if I have an opportunity to monetize something that I'm enjoying, why not do it? And frankly, just a little behind the scenes, I get like 1 cent per 2 ad impressions is what they call it. I'm not buying a mansion tomorrow on ad revenue. It is really tiny, small stuff. It's just a little something. And in a way, it's almost like this, again, it's a metric that you look at and go, that's pretty cool. But one of the things that was brought up to me was something called Patreon. And for those of you who don't know, Patreon is another platform. But what it does is it takes the content that I create, or additional content outside of the regular podcast, and it puts it behind a paywall. Now, this is one of those things that I have to weigh very carefully. Because on the one hand, while it may be an inconvenience to have a 30-second ad clip, and I know sometimes they just drop in ads at the weirdest times, but if you really wanted to, could you fast forward through it? Of course you could. Do I hope that you stop and you listen for a second or two just so it, reads it and says, hey, we've reached this person? Hey, look, I'm not trying to be a shameless shill, but the bottom line is that's kind of how this whole thing works. But if I put it behind a paywall, it goes from being an inconvenience to something that you have to part with your own hard-earned dollars. And that is a whole other level of, it's a responsibility that I would have to really create additional exclusive content that's behind a paywall. And while I think that's really interesting, I don't know if I have that kind of quality content at this point beyond what I put on the podcast. However, if you would be interested in having long-form versions of the podcast, so as I mentioned, I still have probably another 1 or 2 episodes worth of material from the conversation that I had with Justin. That could be something that I could put up on something like Patreon, and you can hear the whole long, unedited version of what's remaining. Or I'll just keep it for now. Like I said, I'm going to have other guests in between, probably a solo podcast in there about a particular topic that has been kind of stewing around in my brain that I'd like to cover. Or I take a different approach and I do one of these other things. Or maybe it's doing more content on YouTube. As I'd mentioned, I do have some things in the works there. Anyway, although it was, I guess, phrased in a way that was a little bit negative, it's not negative feedback if I can go ahead and take something and learn from it. Certainly, I also know that some people are going to hear this and they're going to listen once, and it's not for them. And I understand that too. I am a new podcaster. This show is in its infancy. I hope that it's going to get better each and every week as I learn how to do this better. And certainly with your feedback, with your interactions, please interact in any way that you can. And at the end of the show, I'll talk about my socials again and the best way to go ahead and reach out. But I haven't mentioned it, but you can also email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. By all means, go ahead, shoot me an email. I'm happy to go ahead and read it and listen. Nevertheless, let's jump back in. Justin Piccirillo and we go a little bit deeper into the history of Hubbard Park. Of course, as I mentioned, Justin has a book, Hubbard Park. So we do a bit of a dive into that history, and particularly in the Northeast, parks and park design is kind of a big deal, and there are certain individuals that are really well known for it, and I'm sure there are across the country in different, geographic pools where you'll go ahead and have a particular designer. We talk a little bit about that, but also how Walter Hubbard, the namesake of the company, how he basically developed the park. As always, we're going to dig into music, a whole bunch more music, and just some other experiences and interesting things as we go along. So let's jump back into it. Thank you all for coming back. Hope you enjoy it. I'll catch you at the end of the show.
It's funny because I also teach a class at night on American history, and one of the questions last night was about the West Peak. So you have on one side of Hubbard Park, you have East Peak, and then on the other side where the radio towers are is West Peak. And even before it was even a park, there was colonization there. And that's the thing that, most people don't get. They just think, oh, well, it was just trees or it was woods. No. There was ice harvesting down at Mirror Lake. There was, up on the top, there was a colony up there, and, houses were being built. And there was actually plans in the 1880s. Well, first of all, in 1830, there was actually, they found gold. A guy named Beach out of Southington, he actually found gold there. And so every prospector known to man ended up going to Hubbard Park in the mid-19th century, looking for some kind of mineral or ore or gold or silver, whatever they were looking for. The only thing they found was deposits of copper, and it was very minimal. That led, when all the people started going there, that led to them actually drawing up plans for a hotel being on the top of the peak.
Really?
When that happened, now this is about the plans were drawn up in 1889, but well prior to these plans being drawn up, there were already people wanting to go up there. So there were a number of houses, the affluent in Meriden. You know, you might know the name Squire Travel. Mm-hmm. You might there's a name Kasabian, Danaher. Danaher was one of the state senators, and he was a mayor, and he had an automobile business. These big names in Meriden actually started building up there. So this all predates the park, Hubbard Park, Walter Hubbard and Hubbard Park. So there was a lot of stuff going on in that area well before Hubbard even came around. So
I think there's a couple areas. So, we mentioned, Nicole, who went to Lollapalooza with us. Her grandparents lived right across the street, and that's West Main, right?
Yeah.
They lived right across the street, and I can't think of the plot point, but you could cross the street and go directly into the woods. Now, there are areas that make no sense for there to be like little half walls started to be built. So I mean, or is there an explanation for that? Because it's just the most random things that it's like, why is this wall here? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not a natural marker, at least seemingly, unless someone was trying to build a property there.
Well, I'm not sure what the wall you're speaking of, but there's beehives. I don't know is that what you're. So if you cross the street where the woods are,
yeah.
But that at one time was called Lyra Park. Lyra Park was all the woods there, and it wasn't a competing park, I guess you can say, but it was. I'm not going to say competing because it wasn't, but they had a glee club. They had an actual chairperson, and people would meet at that park quite regularly. And there's not much known about Lyra Park. There's a postcard. You can go in the newspaper and read little things about, the Glee Club meets here on Wednesday nights.
That's so strange.
But but so in between the two, so you have West Main Street that separates the two. But on the other side of the street, there's a little little brook, a little brooklet that goes under the road. So you got the Hanging Hills, drops the water to Mirror Lake. Mirror Lake drops into Crow Hollow, and then it goes under the street. And there's a waterway that goes down West Main Street. In that little brooklet there is a beehive, and it's a beehive made out of rocks. And there's several of these beehive motifs throughout the park. So I mean,
maybe that is it, Justin.
Yeah, probably.
They're stone beehives.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
Yeah. When 691 came in, they actually tore down a few of these, and we have one remaining way up on the white trail, way up on the trail. But if you go to where the children's playground used to be, where we used to play in the playground behind the skate house there, if you follow that, not many people know this. If you follow the railings down, the railings are actually there's beehive motifs even there too. So when Walter Hubbard, Jason, you know what? This podcast is going to go on this is going to be like three episodes long.
Hey, even if for a niche audience, and it's like all the people who are like from other parts of the country are like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. Right now, the fact that you're telling me that I went to that place all the time, that I've never noticed that there are beehive motifs going down into that playground, I am all ears.
All right, so Walter Hubbard. So give you a little story on him. I'm going to be chewing your ear off all night. You know that, right? So
I do know that.
So Walter Hubbard, right? He had a little storefront. He ends up being asked by his brother-in-law. His wife died a couple months before, like 6 months before her 20th birthday, around 19 years old. Let's just say that. Well, anyways, he ended up marrying into this family. The brother-in-law says, come to our business. We got this business. We're making clocks. We're making all these different things going on right now. So Hubbard does. It eventually turns into Bradley and Hubbard. Bradley and Hubbard is a very big manufacturing company, lasted to 1940. Well, that's how he made his money. He was the president of this, but he got pretty burnt out real